The 2023 BRICS Summit was the most important event in BRICS history, with huge news impacting the United States and the dollar and the global landscape. So in this video, let's talk about the 5 biggest takeaways from the BRICS Summit and what it all means going forward. We have to start with easily the biggest news coming out of the summit, which is BRICS membership has officially expanded. And this is significant because the last time this happened was all the way back in 2010. The acronym BRIC was first created in 2001 by a Goldman Sachs economist who used it to describe fast-growing economies that he predicted would collectively dominate the global economy by 2050. The leaders of the initial 4 BRIC countries, led by Brazil, Russia, India, and China, met together in 2006 at a United Nations event which began a series of high-level meetings over the next couple of years, ultimately culminating in the first official BRIC Summit in 2009. Their focus during and after that first meeting was to improve the global economic system, reform financial institutions, and strive for a new world reserve currency, taking an indirect shot at the dollar. In 2010, South Africa joined the bloc with backing from China, and since then, BRICS has received dozens of formal and informal applications from countries around the world that want to join BRICS. Many developing and emerging countries from around the world feel aligned with BRICS in the sense of needing to create a separate world, economically, politically, away from the countries in the West, specifically the United States. And while the BRICS countries have created more bilateral relationships with these countries around the world, no new countries have been admitted to BRICS. That is, until recently. The 5 countries' goals are vastly different, so it was too difficult for them to come up to a consensus agreement on not only what countries should join, but how this process should look going forward. The BRICS countries have economies vastly different in size and governments with differing foreign policy goals, a complicating factor for a bloc whose consensus decision-making model gives each member a de facto vote. But finally, a decision was made by the BRICS countries to invite Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates to the bloc effective January 1st, 2024. With these new additions, it was very clear that BRICS had 2 goals. The first was to try and even the regional power within the BRICS bloc. You'll notice there were no new Asian countries. That's because with China and India having the 2 largest economies within BRICS and the 2nd and 5th largest economies in the world, respectively, it seemed unfair to give that region more influence. You'll also notice that Africa gained 2 new entrants. This is because from a global standpoint, South Africa is certainly not considered a powerhouse. And while they might be the informal leader of Africa, from an economic standpoint, they're actually the 3rd largest economy in Africa. So the addition to Egypt and Ethiopia attempt to give Africa more say on the global stage. And with Brazil out in the middle of nowhere all by themselves, they needed a friend too. And since they have been wanting Argentina to join for a while, they got their wish to bolster BRICS Latin American ties. Now, here is where I need your help. BRICS used to be such a clean acronym, but with the 6 new additions, there are just way too many vowels and I couldn't come up with a good one. So down in the comments, let me know your best thoughts about what the new BRICS acronym should be. Which brings me to the second goal of BRICS expansion, which is also my 2nd biggest takeaway from the BRICS Summit, which is gaining complete control over the world's energy supply and distribution. By adding Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran, BRICS added the 3rd, 7th, and 10th largest oil producers in the world. And now altogether, BRICS would have 6 of the top 10 largest oil producers around the world. This is so significant in today's global landscape because the United States has worked so hard to have the dollar become and stay the world reserve currency. It all started after World War II. The US created something known as the Bretton Woods Agreement, where gold was the basis for the dollar and essentially tied all currencies around the world to the dollar. The dollar remained a powerhouse until the early 1970s when the United States ran out of money and was no longer able to continue their arrangements of dollars for gold. This was a troubling time for the dollar as the only thing it was able to redeem was more debt. The US had been using the dollar for favorable foreign policy, but its time was running out. So when the US was unable to continue its deal for gold, why didn't the countries just go back to using their own currencies? They literally couldn't because the dollar had been tied so strongly to oil. In 1945, the US made a deal with Saudi Arabia in which the US dollar was the only allowable currency for oil trading. This was the birth of what is known as the petrodollar. So in order for countries to continue powering their country with oil, they needed to hold the dollar to do so, making the dollar a necessity for countries around the world. So fast forward to today, and now these top oil producing countries have agreed to join the BRICS bloc, whose main priority over the last couple decades has been to reduce the need of the dollar globally. If the petrodollar starts losing its share of the world's oil transactions, it could have significant impacts on the US economy. The dollar is tied so closely to oil transactions around the world. Approximately 80% of all global sales are transacted in dollars, but things are changing. Saudi Arabia has already floated the idea of accepting the Chinese yuan for oil transactions with certain countries. And with China buying about 25% of Saudi Arabia's exported oil, we could see a dramatic drop-off in how the dollar is used for these transactions. India recently entered a bilateral agreement with the United Arab Emirates where all oil sent to India will be paid for with the rupee. So this is just a couple examples, but over time, I expect more of these deals cutting out the dollar to become the norm. And if we start stacking these up together, we could start to see how problematic this could be for the US economy down the road. Speaking of de-dollarization, we aren't done. Another huge topic that was talked about at the BRICS Summit was to become more intentional about the use of local currencies. Another superpower of the dollar as the world reserve currency is it's frequently used as an intermediary currency. The dollar has always been seen as a stable, safe haven, and when it comes to international trade, stability is critical. Countries have preferred using the dollar in the past to settle transactions with because first, countries typically had an abundance of dollars as they needed to hold dollars in order to purchase energy, aka the petrodollar. Second, the dollar was seen as reliable and transparent when it came to knowing the exact value of what they were getting. At times, countries found it hard to trust other countries trading in local currencies due to crazy spikes in value, and an unknown when it came to if the country was printing more of their currency to curb inflation. The BRICS Bank, otherwise known as the New Development Bank, has made trading in local currencies part of their bigger economic plan. The bank's president, Dilma Rousseff, said financing in local currencies is one of the New Development Bank's main goals, as it is clearly stated in the bank's General Strategy 2022 to 2026, which stipulates that 30% of all our financing will make use of the currencies of our member countries. What she fails to mention is a majority of the bank's financing is currently in dollars, but that makes sense going back to the reliability of the dollar. Over time, the bank expects the dollar's holdings to go down as new members are admitted with additional capital and a larger portfolio of reserve currencies. The buy-in for new members to the bank isn't clear, but based on this graph, it looks like it depends on the country. The founding BRICS members each contributed $10 billion, but the bank's other current members of Bangladesh, Egypt, and the UAE contributed around $2.5 billion combined. If you like these videos diving deep into the news coming out of the BRICS Summit and you want to see more of them, make sure to let YouTube know by subscribing to the channel. Speaking of de-dollarization, we aren't done. Again, with the BRICS currency being placed on the back burner for now, the BRICS countries have continued to try to come up with more creative ways to reduce the reliance of the dollar and Western ideology. One of the ways they are looking to do this is by developing effective mechanisms for global trade and currency exchanges to gain financial control. The payment mechanism will revolve around local currencies and reduce the US dollar for cross-border transactions. We have already seen this happening in China as the yuan surpassed the dollar for its own border transactions. And now we are likely going to start seeing this on a broader scale. The new payment mechanism being developed by BRICS will provide services to small and medium-sized businesses, multinational corporations, and entrepreneurs. This will be a game changer because as BRICS ramps this up and continues to get more comfortable using the local currencies, the likelihood that they will go back to using the dollar is exactly 0%. BRICS controls 20% of global exports, over 40% of the global population, and infrastructure is slowly improving all around the world, allowing businesses to capture an even larger sector of people than ever before. The other way they're trying to do this is create an alternative to the SWIFT banking system. SWIFT is how banks communicate securely and quickly with each other, and each bank has a unique SWIFT ID. Say you want to transfer money to a friend in another country. You simply add their bank's SWIFT ID to the transaction, and as long as those two banks have an account with each other, they would authenticate the payment request and your friend receives the money. If the banks don't have a relationship, the SWIFT message will be sent through intermediary banks until the payment request is verified. Because many institutions do not have accounts with one another, they rely on intermediaries, and these intermediaries usually have a presence in, you guessed it, the United States because of the current strength of the dollar worldwide. This means that the United States is able to police these transactions and has some control over who can and cannot use the system. The next takeaway from the BRICS Summit is the impact Africa is going to have over the next couple decades. That was the theme throughout the entire summit. Every year, the host nation of the BRICS Summit is in charge of branding the summit to their own liking. And with this year's summit being in South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa named the summit BRICS and Africa, Partnership for Mutually Accelerated Growth, Sustainable Development, and Inclusive Multilateralism. Rolls right off the tongue. Ramaphosa invited 30 heads of state and government from across Africa, and during every meeting, leaders from around the world mentioned how important Africa is for their country's future. Investing in Africa seems to be something everyone is doing these days. China, India, and the United States have invested hundreds of billions of dollars into the continent. But as much as BRICS can help Africa, Africa can help BRICS. With over 1.4 billion people, which is 1/5 of the world's population, this will likely be the next region of the world to take huge steps economically. And everything changed in 2019 when Africa introduced the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was created to reduce friction for African countries trading goods with other African countries. The new development bank sees the same potential. The bank's president said BRICS is a good partner for Africa and will be helping finance physical and digital infrastructure as well as educational projects. How will they likely be funding these projects? The new development bank just issued a 1.5 billion South African Rand bond in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And the bank's CFO said the proceeds will be used to fund infrastructure and sustainable development projects. That's right, we have ourselves a bonus topic. This one is less about the dollar, but is still very important. Did you know there have only been 4 countries with successful missions to the moon? The United States and Russia traded back and forth between 1966 and 1976, but then no one made a trip back until China in 2013, 2019, and 2020. And now the 4th. India landed its Chandrayaan-3 spacecraft on the moon and could cement its status as a global superpower in space. Chandrayaan-3's landing site is also closer to the moon's south pole than any other spacecraft in history has ventured. The South Pole region is considered an area of high scientific and strategic interest for space nations, as scientists believe the region to be home to water ice deposits. This just days after Russia had a failed attempt themselves. Other countries like Japan and Israel have recently attempted to get up there but had failed missions as well. The United States and China both have plans to head back to the moon soon. The space race is officially on, as if we didn't already have enough problems on the one spinning sphere we already live on. However, the moon's surface area is smaller than the continent of Asia, and with an estimated 100 planned lunar landings in the next decade, it could get really crowded up there fast. Let's not forget that the BRICS countries launched a joint committee of space cooperation just last year. The goal of this committee is basically for information sharing and to eventually get up as many satellites as possible to better serve economic and social development in the member countries. I made a video after each of the 3 days of the BRICS Summit reacting immediately to news impacting the dollar and what to expect going forward, which you can watch in this playlist here.